we've realized in the last 75 years or so, a lot of chronic non-infectious diseases have appeared, and really have created a healthcare crisis. We don't see it as dramatic as, for example, right now the COVID-19 situation, because we've learned to live with it, with spending billions of dollars and having the pharmaceutical industry provide us with a never-ending supply of new medications to keep people from dying from these diseases.
Welcome back to another episode of Health and Humanity. Our guest today is Dr. Emeran Mayer. He's a UCLA professor, brain-gut microbiome expert, gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and best-selling author of The Mind-Gut Connection. Dr. Emeran Mayer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Dan, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to you on your podcast.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion about the gut and how it's connected to the brain. So why don't we start there? Why is the gut and the health of our gut so important to our overall well-being?
Yeah, so somebody could say, I'm biased being a gastroenterologist and having spent my entire career, looking at the gut and thinking about the gut. But I mean, there's a lot more to it. And I have to say, since publishing my last book and writing my second book, I'm absolutely convinced, that there is a unique role that the gut plays. And let me just give you a couple of reasons. One is, it's clearly our biggest surface with which we interact with the world. It's like the comparison of a basketball court. If you spread it all out with the little microvilli that make up our lining, the gut lining, compared to about the size of a door that our skin has. So clearly that's one quantitative difference. There's also something from the evolution. So the most primitive life forms were these floating digestive tubes with an opening on both ends, one to take up the nutrients from the ocean, and the other one to excrete the undigestible parts. And that these floating digestive tubes had a nerve net wrapped around them, which allowed them to both to move, but also to generate some form of primitive ancient peristalsis. So they could, that the contractions or the coordinated contractions that this nervous system triggered allowed nutrients to move from the oral part to the anal part of this tube. So that's, our basic blueprint of what life, started. And also about the role of the nervous system, the interaction of the nervous system with this digestive system, which has, as we know today, continues to play a very big role. I mean, this communication of the gut or this tube with our brain, both the big brain, but also the little brain in our gut, has sort of remained a fundamental design principle. And then I would say, the most, so another reason that this is so important is because we've realized in the last 75 years or so, a lot of chronic non-infectious diseases have appeared, and really have created a healthcare crisis. We don't see it as dramatic as, for example, right now the COVID-19 situation, because we've learned to live with it, with spending billions of dollars and having the pharmaceutical industry provide us with a never-ending supply of new medications to keep people from dying from these diseases. But not really dealing with them. And
Right.
I think it's not exaggerated to say that diet and nutrition and the effects it has on that Western diet has on gut health plays a major role in this disease epidemic. So I would say
Yes.
we have an evolutionary reason. We have this disease related explanation, and forgotten what the third point was that I made, but there's a lot of evidence, converging evidence that
Yeah.
I would say supports that.
Yeah, it's really interesting for me. I look at with this virus, and especially when it kind of first started coming out and everyone was learning more about it and the fear of it all was growing, and you often heard, especially in the media, talking about how if you have a pre-existing condition, then you're more at risk. But that was the conversation kind of ended there. We didn't really look at what are those pre-existing conditions, and can most or all of them be prevented. And when you look at them, in my opinion, a lot of that stems from the food that we're eating and the health of our gut, and that leads oftentimes to certain diseases. And of course, during a global pandemic, that will only make you more vulnerable. So I just found it interesting that everyone would talk about these pre-existing conditions, but then not really look at what is the root cause or source of having those conditions.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. So while writing, doing the finishing touches on my book a couple of months ago, this sort of became obvious to me that the diseases that I was writing about were, gut health and diet play a huge role. That they were exactly the same diseases that are the risk factors. Who gets who is more prone to develop COVID-19 symptomatic infections, and who actually dies from it. Now, obviously, there's other reasons that this sort of parallels with socioeconomic factors, that the people are on a poor diet, are generally on the lower socioeconomic spectrum.
Sure.
Unhealthy food is the cheapest food. So if you are in a lower socioeconomic level of society, you will consume, just because it's cheaper, or this unhealthy food. And so there's, so there's many reasons. There's also, disadvantaged socioeconomic groups live in areas with more pollution, and so there's a lot of factors that I think socioeconomic factors play a big role in this, and it's sort of how our healthcare system is kind of neglecting that the population. Yeah. But the link with these chronic what's called chronic non-communicable diseases is pretty obvious, and how that leads to diet.
Yep. It's fascinating stuff. Going back to the gut, I've heard you talk about it before in podcast interviews and media appearances, how we have, when we have certain emotions, we have certain facial expressions that kind of are basically reactions to those emotions that we have. We show that on our face, and that same thing is pretty much going on inside the gut. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I've always said, the gut is in some way a mirror image of our, the emotions that go on within our brain, and that's because they're so closely linked. And I mentioned this evolutionary history, that the nervous system, the most primitive nervous system, was already present right around the gut from early on. So any threat to this. So it's called the hydra, that floating tube. Any threat to this organism triggered an escape response, which was triggered by that nervous system. So it's kind of stayed, the relationship of stress. I'm not sure if we can talk about that. These animals had emotions, but this connection between stress and fear response, and gut function and nervous system function were there from the very beginning, and I think it stayed today. There's some studies that clearly show this, the patterns that we see with anger and with fear and with anxiety, with depression. Unfortunately, we don't have the same the same studies with positive emotions. So, happiness or love um, and they probably will never be done because there's no money in this to pay for these kind of studies.
Sure.
But based on the fact that we have this mirror image of negative emotions, I've no doubt that there's also a correlate with a positive emotion.
Yeah. So what about stress? Like why should we not eat, when we're stressed? Why does that even matter?
So, stress. So, two types of stress. One is the acute, severe stress. So, everybody knows that triggers the fight and flight response.
Mm-hmm.
And there's chronic, could be low grade stress, but the chronic form of stress. Our nervous systems, our stress system, has really developed to deal very well with the acute life-threatening stress.
Mm.
Yes, the fact that we had the fight and flight response is the reason why our species has done so well, why there's animals that have survived tremendous perturbations
Mm-hmm.
in the environment. And so if you stay with that, anybody who has been in this situation knows, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. You may feel like, you have diarrhea. Some people start vomiting.
Mm-hmm.
These things actually still happen with, some of the like marathon runners, which is a very severe form of stress for some
Mm-hmm.
individuals. And so vomiting and, urgency to have a bowel movement, urgency to urinate, are sort of part of this programmed fight and flight response. The goal in terms of the GI tract is to empty the gastrointestinal tract, shut off or minimize the blood supply, so you don't need to use energy for digestion or peristalsis or secretion of acid, because all the energy goes to your muscles and to your heart to be able to fight or run away.
Yeah.
So definitely not a good time to eat something in that situation. You would eat
Right.
against the natural rhythm of what your body wants to do. With chronic stress, it can actually be the opposite. Chronic stress, a major reason for overeating, for this hedonic eating or stress. Like people eat because they feel stressed and they get a short-term benefit from eating, that it turns down the stress response temporarily. But then the kind of foods that work best for that, like the high fat, high sugar,
Mm-hmm.
like bulk food, they in the long term actually make the negative impacts on your body worse.
Mm.
So on the one side, you don't feel like eating, and you shouldn't be eating with acute stress. But with the chronic stress, I think some people have to be really careful, to watch themselves and realize this craving that they have all of a sudden is not related to that they don't have enough calories.
Right.
It's purely driven by the brain and the stress response.
Interesting. How about breath work? I've heard some people say like they like to have take 3 deep breaths before they have a meal. Do you have any thoughts or any kind of input on breath work and how that can affect us positively, to reduce stress, especially when it comes to nutrition?
Yeah, so breathing, it's both simple and amazingly effective. So abdominal breathing, diaphragmatic breathing are sort of the simplest forms. I mean, there's obviously all these yoga type breathing patterns, much more sophisticated and all have specific functions. So I'm not an expert on this aspect, but we have experimented over the years, over the decades, really, with our own patients, and have found that deep abdominal breathing is one of the best ways of putting your body into a relaxed state. And so the reason for that is this deep, this abdominal breathing essentially, instead of breathing, with your into your chest and expanding your chest, which is the fight and flight pattern. So when your body senses that you breathe like this, it sends signals to the brain, and it reinforces this fight and flight response. If you consciously change the breathing pattern into this abdominal breathing, it generates signals through the vagus nerve that go back to the brain, that tells the brain my body is relaxed. And it has the ability of actually attenuating or even sometimes turning off the stress response. And so this is why this has been so effective, not just for anxiety disorders, but for a wide range of, what we used to call functional gastrointestinal disorders like IBS or dyspepsia, or any of these kind of non-organic GI diseases.
Yeah, super interesting. I've been getting into more breath work myself lately, and have seen big improvements just with lowered stress and lowered anxiety and a boost of energy and cognitive ability. It's really incredible stuff. But with the gut, going back to your main message that you really focus on is that brain gut connection. You talk about how there's this continuous loop between the mind and the gut. Can you kind of talk about that system a little bit further?
Yeah, so I look at it. So a lot of people talk about the brain-gut axis, and I have done that as well. It's not really an accurate characterization of that system, because it's really a network. It's a network between circuits within the brain, or networks within the brain, circuits within the gut, and in networks amongst the gut microbes. And these three systems interact in a bidirectional way with each other, so they form this super network. And network science has sort of become, it's sort of becoming the way that cutting edge science looks at complex systems. We've moved away from the simple linear correlation between, here's a cause and here's an effect. Let's eliminate all the other disturbing factors, the noise, and just focus on what happens in the simple system. That works quite well in terms of the scientific method. You can prove hypotheses or discard them, but it does not reflect the reality, or what's called noise in the system is actually our influences of all these other parts of this complex network. And so what a network like this, so the super network, brain connectome, gut connectome, and microbiome, there's a lot known from engineering science or systems biology what the properties are. So it's obviously very resilient and resistant to perturbations. If you stress that system, it will respond to it, but it would also have a tendency to return to its initial state. It also has the property of oscillations, because you have a lot of feedback loops built in, and a system like that oscillates. So we know, from our, we know, a lot about macro oscillations, which is the diurnal rhythm. So probably one of the most important oscillations that our bodies go through, and that affects every aspect of the brain-gut microbiome axis. There's, as we know, changes in the brain. We get into the different sleep phases. We also have a dramatic change in gut function between the sleep and being awake. And we also have dramatic difference for most people in terms of our eating patterns. So most people don't eat when they're supposed to sleep, even though that is part of the stress related eating. People wake up in the middle of the night and go to the fridge and eat something. The worst thing that you can do actually for your metabolism. But this diurnal oscillation is, we now know, also affects the microbes, how the microbes talk to your gut changes between night and day, and this comes mainly from animal models. If you people with metabolic disorders, the frequency of oscillation changes to an unhealthy pattern. So you could almost say in the future, that's what I always think about as a future direction, to measure the health of our bodies, our system. If you had a way to really characterize in detail the oscillatory patterns, that might give you the most sensitive readout, how much your body is in homeostasis. And there's another oscillation, which are the seasons for many parts of the world, also affecting the microbiome composition and function. Certainly affects also the brain. We have these seasonal variations in mood. So I would say that's this system, that just systems biological view of brain-gut microbiome interactions is essential, and it's not that widespread. I mean, if you look at the lay media, there's still sort of this idea. Okay, so it's a linear system. I put a probiotic into the gut, and I'm going to be happy. I feel well. My wellness increases and all this. I mean, that's just not the way it works.
Right. Interesting. How about the connection between nutrition and our mental health? I know some people believe that depression, anxiety, or Alzheimer's, dementia, that can be directly tied back to our nutrition. What are your thoughts there? And also, I guess I'd like to add, just on a personal note here, my family has, on my dad's side, an extensive history of Alzheimer's. He has 7 siblings, and 6 of the 7 all had Alzheimer's. He's 78, so he's he hasn't shown signs of Alzheimer's yet, but on a personal note, it's something that is in my family history, and really, like, my whole life kind of been led to believe that it's something that is from our DNA, something that I was just we acquire from our ancestors. But the more I'm learning and researching, a lot of that can be tied back to our nutrition. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me first say something about this unfortunate family history that and I'm sure it's hanging over you like something that you may have to face in the future yourself. Yeah. So clearly, genetic predisposition for any of the brain or complex diseases is always one risk factor, and you could say in the extreme, you may have a messed up gut microbiome or disturbed brain-gut microbiome interactions, but you have no vulnerability factors, genetic vulnerability factors, and you may never have any negative consequences from your, the disturbance of the system. On the other hand, if you have that genetic vulnerability, then non-specific factors that affect your gut microbiome health, could translate into specific diseases. So one person, and so these non-specific factors may be diet, maybe chemicals in the environment, maybe medications, antibiotic treatments. And so none of these factors are specific for a disease, but the specificity comes in with the genetic predisposition. There seems to be one kind of, that many people right now, and this may change in the future again, tend to identify or have identified is this low-grade inflammation or low-grade immune activation that originates in the gut. And maybe we can talk about this later, but I'll just bring it up here as one common denominator to make you more vulnerable for any of these diseases. So if you have that low-grade inflammation that it has to do with engagement of the gut-based immune system, which is more likely to happen if the gut barrier that isolates your immune system from the microbes in your gut is is not as tight and not as competent as should be. So that appears to has evolved as sort of one common denominator for any of these chronic non-communicable diseases that are, the hallmark of our Western world. So continuing from the diet. So why would somebody develop this less than optimal gut barrier? So the gut barrier is made up of two main components. One are the lining of the gut, so-called epithelial cells, which are really tightly linked to each other. And there's almost nothing that can get through if it's intact. And the second part is a mucus layer. The mucus is produced by specialists that, and it's made up of these sugar-like molecules. So that layer essentially keeps, there's many other functions, but it keeps the microbes away from the sensors in your epithelial layer that can communicate with the immune system. And the way you have to imagine it, some so-called dendritic cells, so these are immune cells, specialized cells, that have these tentacles that stick into inside of the gut from the immune system. They go through the epithelial layer and have these sensors but they only go to one part of the layer of the mucus. So as long as you have a thick mucus, the microbes will not get to these sensors. If the mucus layer is compromised, which comes with an unhealthy, typically with a Western diet, which is, high in sugar, high in animal fat, low in fiber, low in plant-based phytonutrients. If that mucus layer shrinks, if you're on a chronic diet like that, then more and more the microbes, these benign microbes now can come in contact with these immune sensors and can trigger engagement of the immune system in the gut, and that typically does not stay in the gut. And the way you have to imagine is this is not like an inflammation like you get with inflammatory bowel disease. If you did an endoscopy in a situation like that, you would not see inflammation. If you take a biopsy and carefully study the immune cells, you'll see that many of them are engaged and produce molecules now that can get into the systemic circulation and go to other organs, typically to fat cells, to visceral fat cells in your body, turn those cells into immune active cells. They can get into the liver, play a role in fat accumulation in the liver, and can get to the brain. So, coming back to these neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and, to a certain degree, Parkinson's, there is evidence that there is inflammation of immune cells in the brain, different parts of the brain, so-called glial cells, make up about half of your brain cells. And these cells can get activated from these circulating, inflammatory molecules that come from the gut because of the diet. Then they can communicate with these immune cells in the brain. And then these brain immune cells start producing cytokines, inflammatory molecules, which then acts on the nerve cells. And so you have this communication. Really, it starts with your diet, affects the gut, the gut permeability, affects the gut-based immune system, becomes systemic, and gets to the brain. So now if you have your genetic risk factors that produce a certain response then of these brain cells to these inflammatory molecules, that's essentially, I think, what happens in Alzheimer's disease in a simplistic way of explaining it.
Yeah, really fascinating. So is the same thing then for depression? Can that be tied back to the food that we're eating?
Yeah, and I would say, this was sort of what happened in the beginning with when this field started some 15 years ago, that these pretty impressive animal studies came out that you could change emotional behaviors in rodents, first in rats and in mice, by either having these animals grow up in a germ-free environment, so they have no microbes in their gut, or with antibiotic treatments. And it was found there is a relationship between these, what we call depression-like or anxiety-like behaviors. I mean, obviously, these animals can tell us if they're depressed or anxious, but their behaviors sort of are taken for that. And then, people have done studies in humans, and this has always been difficult. And so many things got lost in translation. It's still hard today to really pin down unequivocally that the microbial composition causes depression or anxiety. I personally think it's again a multifactorial system. The bad nutrition will produce these effects in the gut, where we talked about. And it's not just inflammation. There's also other molecules that are being produced by the microbes. So, for example, they change bile acids that are an essential part of your bile that's produced to digest. And there's literally hundreds of these bile acid subtypes. They're secreted into your intestine, and the microbes are specialized in turning them into what's called secondary bile acids. They metabolize them, and then some of them get reabsorbed into our systemic circulation.
Wow.
So they're synthesized in the liver. They help us with our digestion. They get into the intestine. The microbes do some maneuvers on those bile acids. Some of them get back into our systemic circulation, and some of them are actually protective for our brain. A lot of them are protective. But some are bad. So the ratio between the bad ones and the good ones, that determines what effect this has on the integrity of your nerve cells and your brain function. And that's just one of these molecules where the microbes play a role. Same thing happens, like tryptophan, this amino acid that we ingest, essential amino acid that we ingest with our food, that's turned into different metabolites, both by our gut cells, but also the microbes. And there's one of these products, has this complicated name, cannurenine. Another one is serotonin. So serotonin, obviously, we think is a good one. Cannurenine is, if it's in higher concentrations, not so good. And the cannurenine, again, can get into the brain, can be absorbed into the brain, and can lead to what's called neurotoxicity. It can damage brain cells.
Wow.
So I've just given you 3 examples: inflammatory molecules, bile acids, and these tryptophan metabolites. And there's probably hundreds of these. The combination of all of these that get into our system interact with each other, the good ones and the bad ones. So I told you this about the bile acids. Ultimately, the net effect of this in a genetically vulnerable individual, will cause these problems. And so if you're somebody with a risk for depression, you're under a lot of psychosocial pressures, you're an anxious person, which increases your risk for depression. If you also then get this dietary microbiome component, that will make it more likely you develop, the depression. And there is evidence that a subset of patients with depression have this inflammatory component. Not everybody. So it's a heterogeneous population. So I would imagine if you fall into this category of the inflammatory type depression, you'll be much more prone to or sensitive to the dietary factors, and you would probably want to pay a lot of attention on anti-inflammatory dietary component.
Sure. Interesting. So Is there an optimal diet then, or does it depend on our age, our gender, our lifestyle, or the location of where we live? Is there an optimal diet for everyone, or does it kind of depend?
Yeah, all these factors that you mentioned do play a role. So there's a lot of interest now in these personalized diets or individualized diets. I personally think it's a little bit exaggerated that, based on your DNA, based on your genes, people that live in a place like the US, everybody has to have a different diet.
Right.
I personally think that's exaggerated. But clearly, if you live in the Arctic as opposed to live in the equator part of the world, that will influence what diet is optimal for you. So you want
Sure.
in the Arctic, you want a high caloric density diet with high fat. And if you look at the Inuits or other people that live in these Nordic northern climates, they eat a diet that would be considered unhealthy, for people who live in moderate climate zones.
Sure.
Same thing, people that live on the Orinoco River, on the Amazon, or their diet is obviously different than for us living in the US, just what's available to them. But I would say, despite these these very important individual differences, I think I've been a proponent for some time now for a largely plant-based diet. That's based on this general concept that a largely plant-based diet provides the optimal diet for our microbes. It's high in fiber. It's high in phytonutrients. It's low in sugar, and if you eat sugar that's contained in fruits, then it's usually mixed with fiber, so it slows the absorption. And so there's absolutely no question that we now people promote the ketogenic diet, and there's all these in the paleo diet, and none of these diets are optimal for the gut microbiome. And I think what we should think about, if our gut microbiome is optimal in its diversity and richness, that will have a beneficial health promoting effect on gut health. This phenomenon of gut permeability and low grade inflammation. And if you make this sort of the guiding principle in what you eat, that there's no question what diet does that the best.
Sure.
And now then there's exceptions. There's people that have sensitivities. So irritable bowel syndrome patients are more sensitive to, for example, gas production. And they have to find out themselves which of these plant-based components cause more symptoms for them. But even that population, I think, benefits from overall long-term from this largely plant-based diet. Another example is inflammatory bowel disease. So people have for some time recommended, even though there were no studies on it, that a low fiber diet is beneficial for people that suffer from inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. In the meantime, it's flipped 180 degrees that experts are recommending a largely plant-based diet, mainly because with the increased intake of short-chain fatty acids, which are made out of plant-based fiber, you have a natural anti-inflammatory dietary component. So I would say, if you identify the main culprit of our chronic diseases of our times in developed societies, then this low-grade inflammation is at the core of it. And anything you can do diet-wise to reduce that is beneficial for so
Interesting.
It's actually become very simple. It's not like even if you believe in that you have to identify your personalized diet, which is different because your genes are different from your neighbor. Even then, I think the baseline should be the plant-based diet.
Sure. Yeah. That makes sense. How about fasting? Do you believe in fasting? Do you see any benefits to our overall health with fasting and intermittent fasting?
Yeah, definitely. Any type of fasting has probably health benefits, and I kind of differentiate. There's different types of fasting. Typical, you could say, any caloric restriction is sort of some form of fasting. If you look at the animal studies, there's a vast literature of the last 30 years that have shown various health benefits of different types of fasting, intermittent fasting, short-term fasting, chronic low-grade restriction and calorie intake. The problem is, again, the translation. If you look at studies that have analyzed the benefits on metabolic health and metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, obesity, most of these diets work well in the short term. The majority of these diets after a year lose the effect, mainly because people will not adhere to them. There's just so many pressures in our lifestyles that keep you from, and then there's the stress-induced eating. So what you can do, animals don't have a choice if you don't give them the calories. But as humans, we can always say, okay, I've done this long enough now, and I just don't want to. I just want to go back to regular eating.
Sure.
There's one exception to that, which I think is the time-restricted eating, which I don't really consider the same as the intermittent fasting, because you can eat whatever you want based on animal models. The only thing you do, you restrict the time when you eat your meals. And, there's sort of the 16/8. So for 16 hours, you're not eating, and you compress the time you eat your meals to 8 hours a day, which and then I have to say, we've introduced this ourselves in our family, and so I can't really speak from firsthand experience. That is kind of challenging in the beginning, mainly because you're conditioned to have a nice breakfast when you wake up, and you're conditioned to, after dinner snack while you watch TV, or have a glass of wine at 10 o'clock in the evening, or you have friends over and you have a late dinner. So it's sort of, comes in conflict with many things that you're used to socially.
Right.
But once you stick to it, it's really interesting. So first of all, automatically, without trying it, you eat less, because if you skip breakfast and you eat your first significant meal at lunchtime, you don't want to eat another big meal before your early dinner. You essentially come to two meals a day with a couple of snacks in between. Your hunger sensation, some difficulty in the beginning, not having my used to breakfast, that disappears completely, particularly when you're busy. I have no cravings or need to eat something before 12 or 1. And so the good thing about this kind of fasting is it's realistic. Most people can do this on a long-term basis. I always say, if you switch to a diet like this, it should not be a diet. It should become your lifestyle.
Yep.
You make that decision and you do it for the rest of your life, just like the regular exercise or regular meditation or whatever else you do. And the second thing is you take advantage of two things that we know now. So not eating, we know what happens to the microbes. They change the pattern of interacting with our gut-based immune system. When there's no food in the GI tract, you cleanse out your system much more efficiently, because when there's no food in your GI tract, you have these specialized contractions, these high amplitude contractions that cleanse your GI tract. You don't need to do any other cleansing things, and also you get into this ketogenic mode. So particularly if you exercise. So this morning we went on a hike on a nearby mountain here, without the breakfast. And so first you think, this is not I'm going to become hypoglycemic. But the interesting thing is there's absolutely no negative effect on your performance, physical performance.
Right.
But you're now using calories that you generate. You're burning calories that's stored in your fat, and you provide ketone bodies to your brain and to your muscle as an energy source instead of a glucose. And so you have your own phase of ketogenic metabolism, but then when you eat a largely plant-based diet. So you get the advantages of both of these interventions.
Yeah. I've been doing time-restricted eating for, I would say, the last 6 months. And like you mentioned in the very beginning, it was a challenge because you're programmed your whole life to have breakfast. We're programmed to have 3 meals a day. But as soon as you can kind of get past that mindset, you realize, okay, maybe I don't need to be eating all day long. So it definitely gets a little easier over time. And now I'm at a point where, like you said, it's a lifestyle. It's not something that I kind of have to do. It's something I want to do for the rest of my life. And I noticed really great benefits with just improved energy mostly. And even just mental clarity. I feel like, you're not always just feeling slow and bogged down by, all this food. So it's nice. It's definitely,
and it's, I've always talked to people, including colleagues who promoted the ketogenic diet. And, to me, a high intake of animal products is sort of wrong from the beginning, but they always talked about this increased mental clarity. So these were even colleagues, that I trusted. And patients told me that, when I go on a ketogenic diet, I feel so much like my brain fog is gone. So I think what you just said, that there's more mental clarity, that's probably for the same reason, because you are now on an endogenously induced ketogenic state, and it may just be good for your brain function. I think of what we know today, quite honestly, and I always hate this being a scientist, because in my career 80% of my hypotheses that came up were not correct, but in terms of that, what we have arrived at now with the evidence, scientific evidence and personal experience in terms of diet, I feel pretty certain that that's about the optimal recommendation that you can give somebody today. A combination of time-restricted eating with a Mediterranean type diet, or plant-based diet.
Yeah, there you go. There's, I guess, the key takeaways there for our listeners is some time-restricted fasting and plant-based and Mediterranean style diet. Excellent. So before I get to my last question for you, where can people find you online? I know you have a website, you're on social media, you have a new book that's in the works right now. If you want to maybe talk about that too, the contents of the new book.
Yeah, so many of the things that we talked about today, is in a new book. So the focus is on this combination of, it's the latest update on, where the science is in terms of microbiome. I also promote this idea that we have to really focus primarily on feeding our microbes for the microbiome to reach an optimal state, rather than constantly worry about macronutrients. We have enough macronutrients, including protein and that we need for functioning, properly. We don't have. I mean, unfortunately, there are now, exceptions within our society. This food insecurity, which is a growing problem. It's kind of shocking to hear this in a society like ours with the overabundance of food. So there are clearly unfortunate parts of our society that have to deal with this. And I think in that case, the macronutrients still play an important role.
Sure.
You don't want them to live on sugary stuff because they're cheap and not get enough protein. But for many of us who are fortunate enough not to be affected by this low-grade malnutrition, I think we have to really forget about worrying about your protein bars and your protein shakes and all this kind of thing. And if high fat or low fat is good, I think we have to really think about what's best for our microbes, our microbial health, because that means optimal microbial health means optimal gut health, means less low-grade inflammation, less, So I think that's one concept really pushed in my book. Another one is the understanding what's in plants that is so important for our health, both gut microbial health, but and this is not just the fiber, even though that's a big part of it. It's also these, what we call phytonutrients or polyphenols that are often, or that are generally mislabeled as antioxidants. The antioxidants in the test tube, but when we eat them, they're a food for our microbes that turn them into bioactive molecules. And then another sort of key point of that is what I mentioned in the beginning, this One Health concept. If we eat largely a plant-based diet, if everybody did that, it would have tremendous effects on the health of the planet. There's more and more people talking about this, that a big reason for deforestation in the Amazon is the insatiable appetite for beef and for soybeans to feed the cows. And so it's definitely not a coincidence that our health crisis right now, these chronic non-communicable diseases, and the destruction of many ecosystems in the world. I mean, they go in parallel and they are related to each other. They're not independent phenomena. So I would say focus on the health of your microbiome with your diet. Really think about all the good things that are in the plants. And the third thing, whenever you think about eating healthy, think about, is this healthy for the planet as well? I mean, those are the main. So, I mean, I would say, the easiest way for people to get in contact with me is to go to my website. There's a lot of resources. As you know, there's podcasts, there's interviews with key opinion leaders, my latest publications, and this is emeranmayer.com. You can also sign up for the newsletter, which comes out every other week, dealing with hot topics in this space. And you can also reach me on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So I would say if you start with my website and sign up for the newsletter, you'll be kept up to date to all the latest developments.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to have all that linked up in the show notes for our listeners.
That'd be great.
My last question for you, and I believe you probably answered the question mostly in the previous question, but who do you want to impact the most with your work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So when I published my book, I was still primarily an academic gastroenterologist who who was mainly concerned about talking to my colleagues. Um, and that has sort of dramatically changed because the book led to invitations like this podcast, hundreds of these kind of podcasts,
Sure.
to meetings and to audiences, to non-medical audiences. And I have to say, this has become my main goal now, to reach as many people as I can, the lay public, and really provide an authoritative source of information that goes through my academic, very critical screening before I put anything out or endorse anything. But I think there's still a dire need in right now with so many, what I call false science going out, people promoting ridiculous, health recommendations. So this has really become my main goal: reach as big an audience as possible. If the physicians or my colleagues hear about it, that's fine. But medicine is slowly moving in that direction, very slowly. I think that the public has a much greater, reaching the public directly has a greater potential to influence health than, going through the slow-moving medical system, which is still mainly based on treating diseases, not in keeping people healthy.
Right. Yeah, well, I appreciate that proactive approach that you're taking, and trying to influence as many people as you can to live healthier lives. And really, that's what my podcast is all about, is for people to live happier, healthier, longer lives. So I appreciate your mission there. Well, Dr. Emeran Mayer, this has been a true pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise.
Yeah, Dan, thanks again for having me on this show. Really enjoyed the conversation. I mentioned to you earlier, the output from these interviews has a lot to do with the nature of the conversation. So this has been a good example of an excellent communication that which always comes if you're both on the same wavelength.
Sure.
And share our insights and recommendations. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic. Excellent. Well, you have a great day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.